présenter en quelques mots le CRI-JaDE parce que on aurait long à dire, en fait. Mais donc, la mission du CRI-JaDE, c'est vraiment de promouvoir la recherche, la mobilisation des connaissances et d'outiller nos nombreux partenaires parce qu'on travaille avec beaucoup de partenaires communautaires, institutionnels et également dans le milieu universitaire. Et dans le fond, l'idée derrière nos travaux est de développer des meilleures pratiques et de réfléchir ensemble aux pratiques novatrices et aux enjeux qui touchent l'équité, la diversité et l'inclusion, mais également la justice intersectionnelle et la décolonisation. Donc, le CRI-JaDE, en résumé, nous sommes 73 membres, 48 chercheurs de l'Université de Montréal, mais de différentes facultés. Donc, on a des gens de la faculté des arts et des sciences, de médecine, de musique, de la faculté de droit, de sciences infirmières. Donc, on est vraiment une faculté très diversifiée. Donc, je vais m'arrêter ici parce que je ne veux pas prendre trop de temps, mais bienvenue. Merci beaucoup à tous et à toutes d'être avec nous aujourd'hui. Et je vais donc passer la parole à nos collègues Caroline et Holly.
Merci beaucoup, Isabelle et Annie. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. I'm super happy to be here. My name is Caroline Chapin. I'm a member of the Work Inclusivity Research Centre. I'm also with Emma Surman, Anita Lateano, and Ray Nim Debela, part of the BBS Décoloniser project. And this is why I'm here today. So I'm just going to say a few words and then I'll pass over to Oli. So why this seminar? For those of you who don't know, I'm also Canadian. So I'm French originally, but I spent 10 years in Canada and I have the Canadian citizenship. And Canada is definitely a place which is really close to my heart and I go back to Canada very often. So when I start working on decolonization, it was very important for me to understand, you know, the British context is quite particular, but I thought, what does it mean in Canada? We have a different context in terms of colonization in Canada and how can we learn from those different contexts? So I came across the CRI-JaDE and I contacted Annie and Isabelle, who were very welcoming. We met together, we had a lovely lunch, and then we realized we had a lot of questions that we shared. We wanted to understand how equality, diversity, and inclusion and decolonization, what does it mean for research? How can we apply it into our research? But also recognizing that it may be different across different disciplines and across, obviously, as we said, different geographical context and depending on who we are as a person in terms of our positionality. So this was the origin of this seminar, and we thought, okay, we have those two research centers which have similarities. Can we bring them together and have a dialogue and start a conversation around this? So I'm very happy that we've come this together and very happy that a variety of colleagues have agreed to contribute to this event and we share their thoughts with us today. I'm going now to pass over to Oli, who can say a few words about work and how it fits with what we're doing.
Thank you, Caroline. My name is Holly Burkett. I'm one of the co-directors of the Work Inclusivity Research Centre here at the University of Birmingham, along with Joanne Duberly, who unfortunately can't be here today because she's doing a very big admin role in the university and has been hauled away to a big meeting, but she'd have loved to have been here. So the Work Inclusivity Research Centre is aim of improving inclusivity in the workplace. We have various different work streams. We cover lots of different areas of research around trust, around employee voice, around gender in the workplace, around age, around disability, and we have lots of different areas of research. With colleagues from across the university and beyond. We also try and interpret our research to try and create change outside academia as well. We also, in relation to this, as Caroline's already talked about, there's been a big decolonisation programme going on across our institution at the moment as well, which Caroline's heavily involved in leading. So really, really pleased to be involved today and to start and further develop this dialogue with CRI-JaDE and really start to develop more of a collaboration around these kind of issues for the future. So thank you very much to Isabelle, Annie and Caroline for all the organisation. I'm very much looking forward to all the presentations and discussions today and taking this conversation forward.
Merci beaucoup, Ali. Donc, c'est à mon tour maintenant d'introduire la première activité les premières conférencières, en fait, qui vont être avec nous et qui vont faire l'ouverture et qui vont nous présenter une réflexion sur la décolonisation. Donc, leur conférence s'intitule Décoloniser et prendre en compte l'EDI en recherche. Donc, nous avons avec nous Diarra Traoré. Diarra est titulaire d'un doctorat de l'Université du Québec à Montréal. Elle est socio-anthropologue et professionnelle au centre, au CRI-JaDE, en fait. Ses intérêts de recherche portent sur l'imaginaire, l'identité et les épistémologies africaines en contexte migratoire et en Afrique de l'Ouest. Ses publications incluent l'ouvrage Musulmane ouest-africaine au Québec, entre submersion et conformité. Et elle a aussi publié des articles scientifiques sur les pratiques de guérison, la divination, la migration et le féminisme postcolonial. Elle a également travaillé pendant 12 ans comme formatrice en intervention féministe, intervenante communautaire et directrice dans des organismes servant les femmes et les filles, ainsi que les personnes réfugiées et demandeuses d'asile. Donc, bienvenue, Diarra. Elle sera accompagnée de Donna Ladkin. Donna est professeure de leadership inclusif à la Birmingham Business School. Elle est philosophe et musicienne de formation. Les travaux de la professeure Ladkin sont axés sur ses recherches sur les aspects éthiques et esthétiques du leadership et sur la manière dont il contribue à l'efficacité du leadership. La professeure Ladkin dirige actuellement un ouvrage sur la décolonisation de la recherche en gestion qui sera publié par Edward Elgard en 2025. Donc, je vous cède la parole et je tiens à préciser que la suite de cette conférence, en fait, sera présentée en anglais.
Merci beaucoup, Isabelle. Merci tout le monde. Je ne sais pas si je peux partager mon écran. Je vois que je n'ai pas la capacité actuellement de partager mon écran. Je ne sais pas si Tom Lee, c'est possible de me mettre en co-host.
Je viens de le faire normalement.
OK. D'accord, donc... Merci. Je vais essayer de voir. All right. Thank you so much for having me. First of all, thank you, Isabelle and Annie, and the community of the CRI-JaDE for having me for this presentation. The title of my presentation is Beyond the Cognitive Empire, Mobilizing African Epistemologies in Ethnographical Research. Let me start by saying that any study of African communities is faced with the imperative of restoring the role of colonialism and its effects on the social construction of identities and practices, and on the dynamics of representation of these communities within Western societies. So the knowledge about Africa, the Black continent, and about its populations has long been built on assumptions rooted in a perspective of consumption and exploitation. Firstly, we have the quest for a certain exoticism of colonies and uncivilized people that persists in development sociology and African studies. Secondly, research continues to carry hints of extractivism, particularly with the search for opportunities to exploit human and material resources to meet the needs and ambitions of the center, i.e. Europe as empire. All this preserves a context in which only the Western university is seen as legitimate for producing knowledge, which is still reflected today in the exclusive valorization of academic publications from these institutions to the detriment of work carried out by the universities of the South. This historical and ideological context raises important questions about the legitimacy of the knowledge produced by Western researchers and the relevance of their methodologies. In this brief talk, I hope to convey some of the reflections that have informed my own research and approaches, and I hope to invite you and us to a collective examination of our intellectual posture and production. So I'll start by asking some questions about the usefulness of Western theories in studying African communities, I will follow by a short introduction to the notion of cognitive empire, and will conclude by sharing a possible avenue for change. So my research has focused on religious and spiritual practices and narratives in sub-Saharan African communities in Quebec. My doctoral research was based on a 24-month ethnographical fieldwork between 2008 and 2010, followed by subsequent fieldwork conducted in 2014, 2019, and I'm currently conducting interviews with sub-Saharan Africans in Quebec. I've continued to collect life narratives and observations, and initially, I have to say that my training and education led me to mobilize Western functionalist and structuralist theories. And my methodologies were informed by traditional data collection approaches such as participant observation, interviews, and ethnography. As such, I found myself encountering many challenges, but I'll only speak about two of those challenges today. One is the obsession, the Western obsession with text and classification, and the second is the Western perception of spiritual beliefs as non-scientific. Talking about the obsession with text and classification, the place of textuality in Western epistemology and social research confronted me with difficulties in considering orality and the transmission of knowledge through stories, songs, ritual practices, including the mobilization of the body and of objects, which emerged during my fieldwork. It was therefore necessary for me to create a methodological framework that was adapted to and sensitive to these traditions, which meant rethinking conventional research tools to include these different forms of knowledge transmission. So interview grids, observation grids that are used in academic research methodologies were often inadequate to capture the realities and specificities of the communities I was studying. The Western obsession with classification and categorization is actually very much at odds with the ways of thinking and being among the African groups in my investigations. And if you want to add another layer of complexity, the subjects of my research, namely spirituality and beliefs, continue to cause unease within the academic community in Quebec. So I had to rethink and adapt these tools and starting to consider non-Western perspectives and voices that were often absent in traditional methods. The second challenge was the non-scientificity of spirituality. So translating the data that I collected into the scientific process of analysis and writing highlighted for me the intransigence of Western modalities towards non-Western modes of thoughts and practices. For this reason, my approach had to go beyond the superficial inclusion of non-Western sources in my research to embrace a deeper and more respectful understanding of this local knowledge. This meant challenging conventional research methods and adapting a more holistic methodological framework that considered the cultural and spiritual specificities of the communities I studied. So these pitfalls in my research path were echoed actually in the results of an initiative by Afro-descendant academics from North America in the US, the Caribbean, and South America that gathered in a symposium in 2016, and that came to the conclusion that it was important to consider Afro-descendant epistemologies characterized by the epistemic cohabitation of physicality, materiality, and the spiritual world. So this reluctance to openly address spirituality in Quebec academia created an additional challenge for me as a researcher. Actually, three keywords in my research kept puzzling people. I mean, I definitely had puzzled looks every time I mentioned my topic. One was religion, the second was ritual practices, and the third was Africans. And these are, it's important to know that the dominant paradigm in Western academic research does not always value these subjects and has a tendency to relegate them to the realm of the irrational or the folkloric. And that's actually more striking that 75% of Africans living in Quebec hold a university degree, yet there's a limited recognition given to their knowledge systems and perspectives in academic spaces. And this alone raises some significant questions about which epistemology is appropriate for which subject. Basically, I'm gonna move back talking about the cognitive empire, what is the cognitive empire? Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan author and researcher, in his book, Décolonizing the Mind, The Politics of Language in African Literature, published in 1986, depicted the cognitive empire as a metaphysical formation, which operates through the detonation of cultural bombs at the center of a people's universe and through the removal of hard disks of previous knowledge and memory so as to download into their minds the software of another knowledge and another memory. Consequently, the cognitive empire renders its target intellectually and academically empty to impose its own knowledge. And in this third decade of the 21st century, it's vital to recognize the importance of this ecology of knowledge. The Indian anthropologist Shiv Viswanathan, who's the author of the concept of cognitive justice, poses the problem of traditional knowledge, which is faced with debilitating options. So he talks about ecocide, where nature and the people, along with the system of knowledge that accompanies them, is either eliminated or museumized. Second, the knowledge can be ghettoized and considered as unofficial or illegal through certain forms of intellectual apartheid. The third option is to hierarchize knowledges. In this, the traditional domain is labeled the lesser form and can at best exist as marginal knowledges practiced within the informal economy. So expert knowledge, by contrast, is always treated as scientific knowledge. And sometimes this hierarchy becomes a temporary circle. Local knowledge is seen as ethnoscience, an act of make-do, or what Levi-Strauss calls bricolage. And basically, he concludes by saying that the bricoleur still belongs to a lesser cognitive world. Now, what I propose here is the concept of the geography of legitimacy to describe the places, time, spaces within the mechanisms of production, dissemination, and reception of knowledge. These mechanisms continue to be rooted in a colonial and post-colonial conception of the world and the human beings who inhabit it, and to perpetuate a separation between the sphere and the space of knowledge production and the space of data collection extraction. And subverting this this geography of legitimacy does require a redress of the delocalization of knowledge produced by and about African peoples. And this is what is at the heart of Afrocentric perspectives. The historian and philosopher Molefi Kete Asante sets out 5 dimensions of an Afrocentric approach: an interest in psychological location, a commitment to finding the place of the African subject, the defense of African cultural elements, a commitment to lexical refinement, and a commitment to correcting the history of Africa. So I'll conclude and let Donna pursue with her reflections, but in other words, any integrated and holistic approach to research on Africans in Quebec must integrate different disciplinary perspectives, such as anthropology, sociology, history, post-colonial studies, and many others, because crossing borders does require to be open-minded and agile enough to embrace transdisciplinary methodologies. Transdisciplinarity does imply a crossing of boundaries established by disciplinary canons, which are the guardians of the hierarchy of knowledge, but also a crossing of the boundaries that compose the geography of legitimacy. Thank you. So, Donna, here you have the floor.
Thank you, Diarra. Diarra and I have talked a couple of times in preparation for this session, and I think every time we speak, you kind of learn something new, and it's very interesting just hearing you talk again, because what it occurs to me is that my into this space is because I'm currently I teach within a business school. And I'm currently writing a book about decolonizing management research. And as I listen to you, Diarra, one of the things that occurs to me is your project and mine are kind of like mirrors in that you're looking at, a subject of African ways of being, which have often had to go through a Western lens. So African ways of being that have been analyzed and made sense of through a Western lens. Whereas what I'm trying to do is take this subject, management science or management as a discipline, which sits very squarely within the Western sensibility, and actually try to look at it through a decolonized perspective. So it feels like we're trying to do kind of the mirror image of each other. And I think in both, what we're trying to say is that, well, I can't speak for you, but like we're so used to looking at knowledge through, the Western logics. And what we need is to open up those logics and see different ways of seeing those disciplines. So anyway, that was just a kind of reflection in terms of hearing your presentation just then. I'm just going to speak very briefly about this project that I'm involved in and what it is, how it is opening up this space of decolonization for me. So I'm going to start with a quote from McGregor, Madden, Higgins, and Ostertag. They are Canadians who are looking at decolonizing educational practice. And they write, even the most taken for granted aspects of research methodology warrant a rereading, reframing, deconstruction, reconstruction, and transversing with decolonizing commitments in mind. And certainly that has been my experience as I start to go deeper into this project of trying to figure out what it would mean to decolonize management research. So in the next few minutes, there are two different topics that I'm going to cover. One is, well, we talk about decolonizing and colonizing. What am I meaning as I talk about that? And secondly, I'm just going to touch on 3 areas of research that bringing a decolonizing orientation to seem to be particularly important. So in terms of what I'm meaning by a kind of colonizing mindset or a colonizing orientation, I think, Diarra, in your presentation, you actually hit on most of them already, but I'm just going to bring them to the fore. So, and I think this has been theorized in many ways, but the 3 aspects of the colonizing orientation that I'm finding particularly salient in the work that I'm doing are the tendency toward extraction, whether that is extraction of minerals, natural wealth, or in the case of doing research, the extraction of ideas, the extraction of expert knowledge, exploitation, that is, getting as much as one can for as little that one can put into it, which some would say, that's actually at the heart of the capitalist project itself, exploitation, and then finally control. And I think, Diarra, when you talked about, the need to categorize and the need to put things into categories and bifurcations in particular, for me, that's very indicative, not just for me, but other scholars as well. It's very indicative of this kind of need to control. So those are kind of 3 aspects of a kind of colonizing orientation, which certainly I find within management science generally, and which in looking at, well, if we're going to do research in management differently, how do we address those 3 tendencies? So 3 areas of research, and I think they apply to management research, but I think they apply to other aspects of social science research more generally, that I think are particularly that we need to attend to. First of all is purpose. So in my work, one of the key things I've been doing is going back to some of the earliest management studies, studies that are part of the kind of management Bible, as it were, in terms of Taylorism, in particular ideas of scientific management, ideas of the Hawthorne experiments, which are about productivity, and mining those for what was really going on in those studies. And, what we see is that they're very much about exploitation. They're very much, many of the early management studies were about how can we get the most work from people? Does it happen if we put more lights on? Does it happen if we let people talk? What is the social aspect that actually gets more productivity out of people? So, purpose, and looking at the extent to which a purpose is actually aligned with a colonizing, or those kind of colonizing predilections toward extraction and exploitation and control. I mean, even, you don't have to go back as far as the early experiments in management science. You just have to look at most management journals today, which I've been looking at a lot for this work that I've been doing. And if you look at a large number of studies that are done within management science, the purpose behind them is really about increased productivity and increased profitability. They echo that predilection toward extraction and exploitation. So really thinking about purpose and what the purpose of a research study is and who will benefit. Secondly, who should be involved? So one of the things that for me is really turning how we conduct research on its head for me is this idea of who should be involved in research projects, who should be involved in fashioning research questions. There's a taken for granted assumption within the Western canon that the research is a very interesting position that the researcher is often in, because they're offering research questions, so they don't know, but yet they know enough about a situation or an experience or phenomena that they know what questions to ask about it. And actually, if you think about it, if you really don't know a domain, you actually don't know what questions you need to ask. And yet this taken for granted assumption that the researcher actually knows quite a lot, when in fact, it's often not the researcher that knows quite a lot, but the people who the researcher goes to, those people are not often involved in fashioning the research questions. So who should be involved in both fashioning the design of the research, but also being involved in the research as well? And oftentimes within a Western tradition, because Western research methods are often about controlling. You control the environment. The best research is when it's done in a laboratory where you can control everything that's going on. But when you do that, you lose what is real about the phenomenon. And then that leads to the last point. So moving on from who should be involved to looking at, well, what is this research really trying to do? And much of Western research, or research that aligns itself with a kind of colonizing perspective, is actually about simplifying complex phenomena. When in fact, if we look at more indigenous perspectives to undertaking research, they are often, their aim is often to look at the complexity, to reveal something of the complexity and the intersections that are happening within a phenomena, because it's often in those intersections that the real dynamism is occurring, rather than in the categorizations and the classifications that we love so much as researchers. And my final sort of point that I want to reflect on is the fact that even in this presentation, I've offered you categories and classifications. I've offered you 3 points here and 3 points there, which is a kind of orientation to simplification, to making things in a way that we can control them, that we can make sense of them. Whereas perhaps a more real way or a different way of engaging in this phenomena would have been for me to talk with you for 10 minutes about how difficult this is, how complex it is, and the many different days that I wake up and think this is an impossible project. So I'll end there. I think we have a few minutes, and Diara and I were just going to have a little bit of a conversation between the two of us. And I think the question that we wanted to pose to one another was around the personal challenges that we experience in this space. Is that right? So Diara, do you want to pick up on that?
So the personal struggles, I think I touched a little bit on my presentation, but couldn't go in depth due to the lack of time, is my own positionality and the legitimacy that is basically attributed to my position as a scholar, as an expert. How within academia, I find myself in a place where first, the topics that I am addressing do not have legitimacy in academic, scientific, Western perspectives. I mean, spirituality, ritual practices, religion, and African communities, the dark continent. And me as an African woman myself, talking about this as a woman using feminist epistemologies on the one hand, as a scholar that's mobilizing religious studies and not quite fitting into the religious studies paradigms, and conducting field work where I'm talking about rituals and identity and intersectionality of identities of the people conducting those rituals. Basically, I find myself quite often either dismissed because of the topic that I'm addressing, as not really being a serious topic of research, a serious topic of inquiry, not really relevant enough or useful enough for current societal issues. On the other hand, who I am to speak about it. So I think Spivak, back in the days, asked, can the subaltern speak? And I find myself very much in a posture where I am considered the subaltern, and therefore not really given the space or the recognition in terms of having expertise. I'll give you one simple example, an anecdote. How there was an African, there was a little conference, what they call it, a short presentation, like a symposium. It was basically a 2-hour thing. And I was invited to speak about my research. And there was this young, white, French Quebecer young man who had just been to Africa for 3 or 4 weeks for field work. And I presented my research, and everybody had very critical questions about the validity of my methods and how, what kind of proof I had of what I was advancing. And the minute he presented his research, his data that had been collected over a period of 3 weeks only in a country he had never stepped foot in before, everybody was wowing and clapping and asking him questions about his supposed expertise. So even the question answer period was not really critical, but it was mostly validating his expertise. And that alone, I think, is a good illustration of how I think as a personal struggle, I'm still struggling for legitimacy on expertise about African communities. How about you, Donna? How have you?
To be honest, I'm just sitting with that story for a moment and, well, imagining it. Yeah. And I guess before we move on to me, I just have a question about, are there spaces in which you do feel legitimized and where the knowledge that you're creating you do feel is being taken seriously? I'm just curious to know, what are those spaces and how are they constituted, I guess, if they exist?
In my experience, they do not exist yet. They are being created. I believe that the space today that is being created by this joint endeavor is one of them. And I want to thank also Annie and Isabelle, who actually, instinctively reached out to me and said, hey, would you like to actually present some of your work for the opening of this seminar? Because, you do have some expertise. So that recognition alone, I think, is creating space. And the nature of the CRI-JaDE as a center, I hope, will be creating space for scholars, other scholars like me.
Thank you. It just strikes me that, you know, it's like huge realms of wisdom, knowledge, insight have been cut from the cloth of, you know, cut off of the cloth of what we consider knowledge. And yet, you know, when we think of the really pressing issues that humanity is facing at the moment, how, you know, the rational approach has got us here. You know, we're going to need something else to get us out, I think. So anyway, yeah, so in terms of my own struggles in this area, I mean, first of all, I mean, like I said at the end, I mean, I every time I sit down to write in this space, I feel the impossibility of it, in that management science as a discipline, it's hard to imagine a discipline that is more centered within a kind of colonial orientation. So I guess it's that, you know, one aspect is that. But as well as that, there's something, so one of the arguments that I'm trying to make in this book is around the centrality of a relational understanding of ethics as central to a decolonized perspective. And, you know, so one of the authors that I have been reading is another Canadian, Jim Chaney, who writes about his experiences working with Indigenous communities and talking about ethics, and coming back and saying, actually, in this culture, there's no word for ethics, because it's just the way that we relate to one another. You know, it's just the way that we are. And trying to, so even this afternoon, I was reading an article about, it was written from an economic perspective, and the economists are trying to make the case for, or trying to discern the extent to which the British economy was positively affected by the slave trade. And they come up with all kinds of models and, you know, regression analyses and all kinds of analyses. And the language is so, you know, there's never a thought that, you know, these are human beings, that the ethics of this entire situation, you know, slavery, are never considered. And it's quite chilling, that separation of, you know, this kind of knowledge base from the ethics of slavery. And, you know, it's never mentioned. And that ability to just separate those things out, I find really difficult. Yeah. So I'll end with those thoughts.
Thank you, Donna. I don't know how we're doing in terms of time.
I was going to say you're doing fantastically. You started a little bit late, so we thought we would give you an additional few minutes before we go on to the panel. But thank you very much, both of you, in terms of your overview and your dialogue, and actually starting to think, what does it mean in practice in terms of the challenges and the issues, trying to consider decolonization, or, you know, of how the knowledge and the legitimacy. I think it's helped us to move onto the panel. So the objective of the panel was to follow on your footstep and to have a look how we can take into account equity, diversity, and inclusion. I'm conscious we've talked a lot about decolonization, but some of our contributions are also going to be looking at EDI and our decolonization in research, in practice, and looking at those opportunities and challenges. So we have 4 speakers, 2 from the CRI-JaDE and 2 from Work, who are going to share their experience. We've given them a very tough challenge of contributing for 8 minutes, and then hopefully we will have time for questions across the panelists and with you, bringing you in as well, Dara and Donna. So our first speakers is Karin Fofu-Kresh, Karine holds a PhD in sociology from the Université de Montréal and a master degree in education science from the Université de Montréal as well. She also has a master degree in public law from the Université Paris II. She was awarded the Marc Gagnon Prize for the best MA dissertation in education in 2019. She's a member of the executive board and the student committee of the CRI-JaDE. Her research interests include social and educational inequalities and equity issues in relation to systemic discrimination and social and ethnic stratification. Her PhD dissertation project concerned the implementation of equity, diversity, and inclusion policy in higher education. So, Karine, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for inviting me today. Donc, bonjour tout le monde. Je vous remercie, je remercie le CRI-JaDE de m'avoir convié, de m'avoir donné un espace justement pour parler de mon travail de recherche et mener une réflexion sur la mise en œuvre des politiques d'équité et les défis concernant cette mise en œuvre. Donc, ma présentation se fera en français, mais le PowerPoint est bilingue, donc ça permettra aux personnes anglophones de suivre plus facilement. Alors, je vais partager mon écran. Alors. Alors, mon travail de recherche porte sur la mise en œuvre des politiques d'équité, de diversité et d'inclusion dans les universités canadiennes. Et je m'intéresse plus particulièrement à la mise en œuvre de ces politiques au sein de l'Université de Montréal. Donc, ma présentation aujourd'hui va s'articuler autour de trois grandes parties. Donc, tout d'abord, je vais présenter brièvement ma démarche de recherche et puis la problématique qui m'a amenée à m'intéresser donc aux politiques EDI dans l'enseignement supérieur. Ensuite, je vais vous présenter finalement le cadre théorique et méthodologique que je vais mobiliser, l'intersectionnalité, comme étant donc un cadre théorique qui permet d'analyser en profondeur les relations de pouvoir qui touchent, les relations de pouvoir imbriquées, multiples, qui touchent toutes les sphères de la réalité sociale. Et je terminerai par évoquer les opportunités et les défis. Alors, je me suis intéressée à ce projet de recherche du fait de ma propre expérience au sein des institutions occidentales, et notamment à l'Université de Montréal. Les différentes les expériences finalement de micro-agressions qui touchent les communautés racialisées et notamment les étudiants au sein de l'enseignement supérieur, expérience que j'ai moi-même dont j'ai moi-même fait l'expérience, m'ont amené à me questionner finalement en me disant mais comment expliquer que malgré des décennies de politiques finalement visant à lutter contre les discriminations systémiques, le racisme systémique, plus de 20 ans après, on en est toujours au même point. D'où donc mon intérêt pour la mise en œuvre de ces politiques à l'Université de Montréal, le site qui est le site dans lequel je suis. Donc, je vais mener une ethnographie pour comprendre de l'intérieur comment ces politiques sont mises en œuvre et surtout comprendre qu'est-ce qui explique les freins finalement à la mise en œuvre et quels pourraient être les leviers permettant vraiment de rendre ces politiques plus efficaces, enfin, en tous les cas, qu'elles puissent se traduire par des changements véritables. Alors, j'ai donc d'abord mené une revue de littérature pour comprendre ce que que dit la recherche sur la mise en œuvre de ces politiques. Et il ressort globalement le bilan qui est fait, donc c'est un bilan plutôt mitigé avec un certain nombre de critique émise à l'encontre de ces politiques. On parle de politique marketing qui viserait simplement à redorer l'image des universités dans un contexte de restrictions budgétaires. Il s'agirait d'attirer des étudiants étrangers. On parle de diversité cosmétique qui serait donc simplement une façade, ou même lorsque soit les étudiants ou les académiciens racisés sont recrutés, ils sont finalement des tokens. Donc, c'est un recrutement symbolique qui finalement permet à l'institution de justifier qu'elle met en place des actions. Et puis, les professionnels racisés dans un certain nombre de recherches vont évoquer leur marginalisation et la dévalorisation de leur savoir, des savoirs ethnoculturels. Et donc, notamment, l'intervention de Diarra Traoré a très bien illustré ces mécanismes finalement d'invisibilisation ou de dévalorisation des épistémologies minoritaires. Puis, je me suis également penchée sur les statistiques, parce que comme dit Sarah Ahmed, une chercheuse qui a travaillé sur ces questions d'EDI dans le contexte britannique notamment, et qui donc est très critique vis-à-vis de la mise en œuvre de cette politique, elle nous dit, au-delà des discours, regardons concrètement l'impact des politiques. Et l'une des manières d'analyser l'impact des politiques, c'est d'analyser les chiffres. Alors, que disent les chiffres? Malheureusement, les chiffres nous permettent de constater qu'il n'y a pas tellement d'avancées véritables d'un point de vue structurel, puisqu'on est encore sur une stratification socio-professionnelle, genrée et ethno-raciale. Globalement, aujourd'hui, certains groupes, les groupes historiquement défavorisés, et notamment les groupes qui ont subi la colonisation, les personnes autochtones et les personnes d'ascendance africaine, sont encore concentrés sur les emplois les moins bien rémunérés, assortis de conditions de travail les plus difficiles. Et donc, cela amène à s'interroger finalement en se disant, mais est-ce que cette situation n'est pas finalement, n'a pas un lien avec le processus colonial qui, pour un certain nombre de chercheurs, est toujours à l'œuvre. Et je vais citer ici une chercheuse canadienne, autochtone, donc c'est Sheila Cotemek, qui explique que dans le contexte canadien, le processus colonial n'est pas en fait terminé, on est en plein dedans, et ça l'amène finalement à questionner nos pratiques. Et je pense que tout chercheur doit, lorsqu'il s'intéresse en fait aux politiques EDI, au processus de décolonisation, doit s'intéresser à la réalité actuelle. C'est concrètement prendre conscience qu'on est encore dans un processus colonial avec tout ce que ça peut impliquer. Et puis, ce qui est intéressant également de noter, c'est la manière dont justement le processus colonial opère. Et ça a été très bien analysé par Frantz Fanon, qui nous dit que, quels que soient les contextes, la colonisation est toujours assortie finalement d'une dévalorisation des minorités, parce qu'il faut justifier finalement au sein du groupe majoritaire, il faut pouvoir véhiculer l'idée que le colon est supérieur. Voilà, il y a toujours cette ambiguïté, c'est-à-dire que même on peut mettre en place des politiques, mais la mise en place de politiques s'inscrit dans le cadre de ces politiques, de ce processus colonial-là. C'est pour ça que lorsqu'on parle de décolonisation, il faut commencer par s'interroger sur ce qu'est la colonisation et vraiment, cela permet de comprendre qu'on est toujours en plein dedans. Alors, l'outil, alors je vais à présent parler de ma démarche théorique et méthodologique. Je vais m'appuyer sur le paradigme intersectionnel. Alors, qu'est-ce que l'intersectionnalité? Bon, je vais prendre la définition qui est très complète de Collins et Bilguet. Intersectionality investigates how intersecting power relations influence social relations across diverse societies as well as individual experiences in everyday life. Donc, on voit ici que la démarche intersectionnelle, le paradigme intersectionnel nous invite finalement à considérer les catégories identitaires comme des catégories de pouvoir. Alors, concrètement, qu'est-ce que cela signifie? Cela signifie qu'on est dans des systèmes d'oppression multiples et lorsqu'on analyse le contexte universitaire, par exemple, il s'agit de faire le lien entre le contexte actuel et la dimension historique, géopolitique, globale et locale. Donc, un certain nombre d'enjeux, finalement, sont reliés et on ne peut pas comprendre le contexte des pays occidentaux sans tenir compte des relations nord-sud. Alors, en ce qui concerne les opportunités et les défis concernant la mise en œuvre des politiques EDI, un des premiers piliers serait, dans le cadre de ma démarche et dans le cadre d'une démarche équité, diversité, inclusion, oser interroger le rôle du paradigme capitaliste et de l'impérialisme comme facteur explicatif des iniquités sociales, des dégâts humains et écologiques. C'est-à-dire que au niveau de l'EDI, on a le terme EDI, donc équité, diversité, inclusion. Ce serait très long à approfondir en si peu de temps, mais globalement, les politiques EDI ont tendance à invisibiliser l'enjeu majeur qui est l'enjeu d'équité. Et quand on parle d'équité, voilà, on est sur... on parle de justice sociale, on est vraiment sur des valeurs et des principes fondamentaux sur lesquels les sociétés occidentales elles-mêmes affirment s'appuyer. Or, les politiques EDI mettent de côté l'équité en considérant la diversité. C'est davantage le concept de diversité qui est mis en avant. Or, ce concept de diversité, et qui est largement critiqué par les chercheurs, ce concept de diversité, finalement, va invisibiliser les exigences d'équité. La diversité, quand vous interrogez, quand on mène des enquêtes pour savoir qu'est-ce que la diversité, on va se rendre compte que la conception de la diversité va varier selon les publics. Ce terme traduit finalement les diverses composantes de la société, toutes les différences sont prises en compte du fait que l'enjeu de ces politiques, c'est finalement les inégalités, les discriminations. Donc, c'est déjà un premier élément très important à soulever. Donc, lorsqu'on parle des politiques, on ne peut pas parler de politique EDI sans faire le lien finalement avec le paradigme capitaliste. Et certains chercheurs vont aller jusqu'à parler de capitalisme racial. On ne peut pas occulter cette dimension. Et puis, je rappelais la nécessité de lier le local et le global dans nos analyses. Donc, situer les iniquités et les discriminations dans le cadre plus large de la géopolitique mondiale, donc des rapports de domination nord global, sud global. Concernant les processus d'élaboration des savoirs, il s'agit de questionner justement ces processus au sein de la recherche, au sein de l'académie, en lien avec donc les notions d'inclusion, de décolonisation des savoirs. Et puis, les réflexions sur la liberté académique doivent s'inscrire dans le cadre plus large des rapports de pouvoir structurels et en lien avec les phénomènes d'exclusion et de violence épistémique. Parce qu'on constate qu'actuellement, les réflexions qui sont menées sur la question de la liberté académique occultent cette dimension. Alors, en guise de conclusion, je vais évoquer la posture du chercheur qui, donc quand il est dans c'est finalement la posture que doit être celle de tout chercheur, et plus particulièrement lorsqu'on est dans une posture justement de décolonisation et de prise en compte de l'équité, c'est cette posture réflexive sur sa propre positionnalité. Et bien souvent, lorsqu'on appartient au groupe majoritaire, on va avoir tendance à se penser comme représentant l'objectivité. Et inversement, les postures, les épistémologies minoritaires vont souvent être perçues comme n'étant pas objectives, mettant trop en avant leur subjectivité. Or, les féministes, les analyses menées par aussi bien les afroféministes et de manière générale les féminismes postcoloniaux, ainsi que les féminismes du standpoint, nous montrent bien à quel point tout savoir est situé. Donc, tous les points de vue sont nécessairement situés et il s'agit d'en tenir compte. On parle à partir d'une certaine compte tenu en fait de son histoire. On est soi-même inscrit dans des rapports de pouvoir et d'interdépendance qu'on ne peut occulter.
Karine, je vais vous interrompre parce qu'en fait, vous faites une super transition et surtout, vous avez dépassé un petit peu beaucoup le temps, donc il faut laisser la place aux autres. But thank you very much. That was amazing, and I really, really like your point on positionality at the end. I think it's going to link very nicely to Paul's contribution. So thanks a lot, Karine.
Merci.
So our next panelist is Paul Lewis. Paul is an associate professor in the Department of Management at Birmingham Business School. He is also the co-director of the Center for Responsible Business at the university. Paul's primary research interest is how economic product is generated and distributed within national economies. He approaches this from both industry and factors of production perspective, utilizing comparative statistical and institutional analysis. Paul is currently co-leading a research workstream from the African Center of Excellence for Sustainable Cooling and Cold Chain at the University of Birmingham. I will put the link in a moment. The purpose of this program is to treat cooling provision as critical infrastructure within complex systems which combine natural, social, and technology elements in order to provide food, nutrition, medicines, and a foundation for economic development to communities in developing countries, as well as improving food security in development. Paul's workstream, which is co-leading with actually Lisa Jabu, who is around as well today, is to develop a holistic evaluation protocol for cooling project, which can evaluate the economic, environmental, and social dimension represented in the United Nations Sustainable Development Goal over different time scales, different from different stakeholder perspective and under different scenarios. So I actually gave Paul a challenge and he's nicely agreed to do it, which is looking at this project, to what extent does the SE project assume a form of superiority or Western knowledge and a controlled imagination in terms of what sustainable development means when looking at the promotion and implementation of cooling systems in Africa. Also, to what extent does it build on local knowledge and integrate local partners in its conceptualization and realization and let them have their say? How does the research interest and project advance and empower local communities? Is there any danger that it could inadvertently or unconsciously reproduce any form of north-south system of domination or extraction that actually, Dara, you've been mentioning and we've been talking about? And how could the responses to those questions be explained by with funding the project or any other reason? So thanks, Paul, for agreeing the challenge. Over to you.
Okay, thanks, Carolyn. And thank you for inviting me to talk about the project here and to reflect on it, because I think it's something that Lisa and I have been thinking about since we were asked to get involved in this project. Is we don't want it to be a colonial style or even a kind of echo of colonialism in what we're doing. So I thought what I would do is explain a little bit about the program and the project, and then try to use that to engage with the questions that you've asked. So we in our work stream have come relatively late to what is a very large project, and it's funded primarily by the United Nations Environment Programme, but also by the Department for Agriculture in the UK, who are funding it through the United Nations. So it's part of the aid that the UK gives to certain countries, certain projects. So that's the sort of background to it. And the idea of cold chain is that without cooling infrastructure, particularly as we get higher temperatures through climate change, without cooling infrastructure in many places, particularly in developing countries that are very agriculturally based, a lot of the food that is produced starts to degrade very quickly at high temperatures. And so you end up with an awful lot of food that rots and is wasted, and that goes alongside high levels of poverty, high levels of malnutrition, child stunting, these kinds of health problems that come with it. You also get a lot of environmental wastage, because obviously if you're putting a lot of energy, natural resources, fertilizers and the like, water, into trying to produce food, and then the food is wasted because it can't be cooled as it gets to an actual end consumer, or somebody to eat it, then there's an awful lot of environmental knock-on impacts as well. So from that kind of high-level perspective, it makes a lot of sense to investigate what type of cooling and how could it work in certain kinds of circumstances in countries such as Africa, but also this program has been starting to look at in parts of India, and there's a part of it in Kenya as well. But that makes it sound very much like it's applying some kind of external process technology to places that are otherwise struggling, and here we are, the saviors, coming with our technologies and our know-how from the West to come into these places. And to some extent, there is some of that. So when you look at where the technologies that are being thought about are developed, they're developed in universities in the West, and they're piloted in startup companies that seem to be largely US or European, and are funded by organizations like the International Finance Corporation or the World Bank. So the core technologies do seem to be in that colonial vein. Although, as a flip to that, what this project is really trying to do is to understand the local contexts where it is operating, and to try to preserve as much as possible and work with the people that are in those situations. So I'll give an example. What would normally happen with something like a big infrastructure investment in cooling? So that might be cooling centers at the point at which crops are harvested, and then other packing centers further on, and cooled lorries and all the rest of it. You would end up having a push for aggregation, for scale. So a lot of small farmers would end up being bought out, and the land being aggregated into some major farming organization that would make it more economically viable to pay for the cooling infrastructure. You would then see perhaps a push towards crops that are more suited for export because there's more money can be generated by exporting high quality food to wealthier, how that process could go, whereby it really disempowers current farmers, and potentially a lot of the economic value that would be created would get expropriated, would get captured by potentially multinational organizations sitting at key points in the chain. So the program is very conscious of that being one way that this could go and not wanting that. So one of the starting points when we were asked to get involved was, we know there are lots of smallholder farmers in, say, Rwanda, where we started looking at. How would you do this in a way that enables those farmers to keep more of the benefit of whatever infrastructure is put in, and how would it benefit their communities, and how do you do this in a way that it's actually affordable for these people to use this kind of infrastructure? All this in a situation where clearly there are other development priorities as well in Rwanda, you know, the electricity grid, the water supply, there's all kinds of things linked together. And that's where our part of the project, this idea of holistic evaluation, came in that we're trying to think about the different possible pathways through which benefits might be achieved other than immediate economic possible benefits and payback to some kind of investment. So we're looking at, okay, if you were to do this under certain scenarios, what would the potential health benefits be? What would some of the public service costs that might be avoided be? How can you model this in a way that all of the environmental, all of the possible social, all of the health benefits in the medium to long term can be rolled into the way you would value the project, and therefore why it should be invested in by both local government, but also by international donors. And it's quite an unusual way of looking at it for the aid community. Certainly that's what they've been saying to us, that normally you might look at a project like this over time, but it would be a purely economic way of looking at it. And what we're trying to say is, well, that's insufficient. It's one dimension of several dimensions that you'd need to consider. And actually, the major benefits are through the ways that local producers, local communities can be empowered and enriched over time. How am I doing for time, Caroline? Have I got a few more minutes? No, 2 more minutes, yeah? Okay. So what a large part of the project then has become trying to build capacity in the places where it operates. So in Rwanda, for example, there's a university institute being created to try and develop expertise in cooling that can be applied specifically in that country context and in that regional context. And so a large part of the program is employing academics and also working with farmers and community members in that area on trying to develop capacity and work out what an implementation strategy, what kind of technologies would actually work there. So there is quite an effort going into it, not just being the European universities and American donors and UK donors basically coming in, putting something on the ground and going away again. Because I think there is a very real recognition that on the whole, that doesn't work. And there is a history of, particularly in this sector of cooling, of where, say, the World Bank or the EU have gone in and put in place cooling centers in Africa that just haven't been used, and they've not been specified properly, and they haven't been thought of as part of a complex system. And understanding that complex system, I think, and this speaks to what Donna and Diara was saying, requires recognizing that we really are not the experts here, that we need to try to understand the way that communities and farmers and producers operate, and therefore how anything that we can do relates to the way that they work and the way in which they ultimately can help themselves. So that's a very brief kind of attempt at outlining the project. And clearly there are lots of dangers with it, dangers of exploitation. However, we are trying our best to reflect on the way that we're working and to make it more than a Western engineering or technology project applied in Africa and in other parts of the world. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Paul. That was really, really helpful. Okay, now we're changing context completely. We're coming back to the UK with Niamh Abgeler. Niamh is an assistant professor of organization, work and employment at Birmingham Business School. Her academic pursuits and research are centered around key areas in organizational behavior, including the dynamic of trust and distrust within organizational relationship, the evolving landscape of work and flexible working arrangement, as well as concepts like responsible autonomy, power, control, and culture. A notable aspect of Niamh's work is her keen interest in integrating diverse philosophies and methodologies into her research, showcasing a commitment to multidisciplinary and innovative approaches in the field of organizational studies. She will be talking about a research project that she's been conducting with our colleague, Paula Ramirez, which should have been here today, but had a last-minute issue. But the reason they've been invited, that they've been using a very interesting participative research approach in this project that we thought could really talk about this idea of being more inclusive in research. So Niamh, over to you.
Thank you, Caroline. I'm so happy to be here, and I'll be talking about our research regarding peer researchers and utilizing peer research methodology that I have been working with Paulina Ramirez. She has another engagement today and she can't be here. All right. All right, so this project derives from actually one of the projects I've been working and investigating how the people socially and economically healthcare through different technologies and how they can be incorporated into innovation of such digital technologies. So I was involved in the training of the peer researchers. We were quite lucky to have peer researchers from this community through Walsall Housing Group, who recruits different local community members as community champions. So our task was training these champions to become researchers. And the challenge was most of the community members were not educated, and they have not been engaged with any of higher education or even in some cases secondary school. All right. So in this project, we are trying to understand how we can actually use peer researchers in a way that I will link back to the talk about legitimacy. So how we can use these kind of information, these kinds of peer researchers, and then create what is considered legitimate, valid knowledge. So we reflect ourselves, training and our observations with the data collection and analysis, as well as conducted interviews with 10 of these peer researchers to understand what we did well, what were the oversights, and how we can improve the use of peer researchers in future projects. So I would like to look a little bit on, what is the current understanding of knowledge. So we academics go through extensive and exhaustive training, methodological and philosophical training, and then we consider ourselves as gatekeepers of knowledge creation and dissemination. And in some cases, it becomes a bit more, what we were considering, we were talking about inclusivity, and then we started thinking about, okay, when it comes to research, to what extent we are inclusive. Even among academics themselves, there is a hierarchy with regard to can you hear me? Because
we're having some difficulty. Sometimes it's okay in terms of your speaking, but sometimes it's a little bit someone is suggesting, would you want to maybe turn off your camera? So maybe that's going to help.
All right, let's see. How is it now?
For the moment, it's okay.
All right. All right, let me know if it works again.
It's much better.
All right, perfect. So working from home. Where I was, okay, yeah, and when it comes to even us, there is a hierarchy of what is valid knowledge, right? Especially if you do qualitative research and if you send it to a review, an article to a journal, and then you will then there will be comments coming up with regard to how not acceptable what you have been doing. So there is one right way of doing research, which is scientific and objective. That's the consideration by most of the researchers. So when that's the landscape of research, we were considering how the knowledge created by these peer researchers we have, who we trained for 2 days, will be expected. All right, but we strongly we strongly argue and advocate for incorporating peer researchers in some, especially in some areas, to democratize the research and do become more inclusive. And for example, in the area that we collected data, it's a socially and economically deprived area, and as academics, we wouldn't have access to these people who our peer researchers talk to. So for us, it's not a choice, actually, it is a necessity. So if we want to give a voice to these people, we have to include peer researchers who help us to challenge how to challenge the possible stigmas and biases as researchers who are not aware of particular environment, particular group of people that we introduce to our research. All right, so
Niamh, it's still very difficult to hear you. I'm so
all right,
sorry.
I'm going to, I don't know if I'm on Wi-Fi. I'm going to open my door and get closer to Wi-Fi. How is it now?
Okay, for the moment, it's okay.
All right, let's give it another try.
Sure.
So, all right. All right, so as I mentioned, it wasn't a choice, actually, and it is much more of a necessity to give voice to this group of people that we studied. And it helps to mitigate the power imbalances between the researchers and the participants, especially when the researchers here were were from the community itself. So they helped us to add a layer of legitimacy and made us they helped us to establish that our findings are more relevant, meaningful, and more appropriate in terms of the cultural background and presentation of the findings. All right. So this is we also had received some. All right. So we also did took some pictures from the training, and also our peer researchers took some photos during the data collection process, and there are so many different participants they talked to. For example, they went to their homes where was again that creates a layer of inclusivity, because there were areas where there were disabled people or people who wouldn't feel quite comfortable talking somewhere else, and so we by the help of our peer researchers, we access to a rich set of data that we wouldn't access otherwise. All right. And our peer researchers were involved in the project from the start, creation of the questions, to data collection, analysis, and then presenting their findings. And they took so much pride in what they had done. And they were extremely happy because as well as the participants, the community members were extremely helpful, because they thought they were considered to be important. So their voice was heard. We listened to them. We showed that we care about their well-being, and we are trying to help them and understand them and create a change when it comes to use of digital technologies and in healthcare. All right, so what we did was we tried to create a peer research methodology process that builds on our experiences. So this project is a synergetic collaboration that where we co-create knowledge together. Us academics bring the methodological and theoretical expertise and knowledge, whereas our peer researchers brought their lived experiences and helped us to contextualize the data, collect the data, and as well as our community members, which stories were told. And the peer researchers, the advantage of using peer researchers is, as I mentioned before, they have access to these community members. They already have a level of trust built with them. So this helped the community members to open up more, helped to deal with issues like consent and audio recording, because in most cases they were not very willing to be audio recorded, but because of the trust built, built between them, they trusted these members who were who they considered as one of them. So they opened up to them, and we ended up having an extensive amount of rich data. Obviously, there were so many problems going forward. For example, the training was not sufficient enough. And data collection in some cases, for example, our peer researchers were very inexperienced. The first few interviews, they got very nervous, but then they also accepted the fact that as interviews progressed, they gained so much confidence. The interviews become more like conversations. So a level of experience can help in the future. And the weakest area was data analysis. They found analyzing data, the process of coding and identifying things to be quite difficult and challenging. But we did.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think we're going. I think you brought together the challenges. I'm sorry. I'm just conscious of time, and we have a last panelist. But thank you very much for your contribution and for highlighting those challenging and actually how can we bridge that gap of knowledge and enable and empower different type of knowers. I think you really give us a lot of different things, and maybe we can come back to it in the Q&A if it's okay for you.
Yeah, sounds perfect.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay, the final panelist is actually Annie Poulen, who is replacing Sandro Eshakan. Give me a second, so I have my introduction for you, Annie. So Annie is professor at the University of Montreal, School of Social Work, and she holds the Level 1 Canada Research Chair, Réparer, Partnership Research and Empowerment of Vulnerable Youth. In her work, she examined the experience of gender diverse youth, including trans and non-binary youth and two-spirit youth, as well as propose ethical and methodological reflection to facilitate the empowerment of those groups and to confront oppression and facilitate social change. Annie, over to you.
Thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. Donc, je vais faire la présentation en français, mais n'hésitez pas après la présentation à poser des questions en anglais ou bon. Donc, j'ai préparé quelque chose. Vous comprendrez que c'est un petit peu, j'ai préparé ça là, ce matin pour parler un peu des méthodologies autochtones, puisque dans ce séminaire-là, on parle de décolonisation aussi. Donc, je trouvais ça important de parler de ça. Premièrement, je veux remercier Johnny Boivin, Pasha Partridge, qui ont été deux assistants de recherche qui ont travaillé sur le projet dont je vais vous parler ce matin, et aussi Anna Kemsipolsky-Teitman, qui est assistante de recherche sur un comité que je préside présentement, un comité sur la décolonisation de la recherche. Donc, je vais vous présenter des réflexions, en fait, sur comment intégrer des méthodologies autochtones dans un cadre universitaire. Premièrement, de quoi parlons-on quand on parle de méthodologie autochtone? Bien, premièrement, il faut savoir que les méthodologies vont vraiment influencer la manière dont on interprète, en fait, comment on s'engage en recherche, mais aussi comment on va interpréter les résultats, puis qu'on va construire les analyses qui vont suivre. Donc, quand on travaille auprès de communautés ou de personnes autochtones en recherche, c'est important de prendre en compte ces méthodologies-là. Donc, on peut faire des projets de recherche qui vont utiliser toutes sortes de méthodologies qui vont être respectueuses des premiers peuples, ou on peut aller aussi en termes un petit peu plus loin, en termes d'intégrer des méthodologies autochtones dans les processus de méthodologie utilisés. De mon côté, je vais vous présenter un projet où j'ai essayé d'intégrer des méthodologies autochtones au niveau méthodologique. Je veux, par exemple, situer la positionnalité. Je l'ai dit dans l'ouverture de la conférence, je suis moi-même une personne de la communauté Wendat. Donc, c'est certain que ma perspective sur ce que je vais discuter aujourd'hui, elle est peut-être différente de la perspective d'une personne alloctone qui va conduire des projets de recherche. Puis vous allez voir, en fait, il y a aussi des enjeux qui peuvent émerger de ces positionnalités-là et je vais y revenir. Mais quand on parle de méthodologie autochtone, de quoi on parle? C'est ça, ça peut être vraiment diversifié, tant sur le plan des méthodes que des processus qui sont utilisés. Mais généralement, des méthodologies autochtones, ça va aller remettre en question les épistémologies occidentales. Donc, on va questionner même la façon dont le savoir est construit. Ça va viser le développement d'une relation respectueuse envers les communautés et les personnes autochtones dans toutes les dimensions de la recherche, en y centrant leur perspective. Donc, c'est certain que ça va être important d'emmener la perspective des personnes autochtones à l'avant-plan du projet de recherche. Ça va aussi intégrer une perspective transformative qui va viser le développement de la résilience. Donc, les projets en méthodologie autochtone devraient faciliter le changement, la résilience des personnes et non pas juste d'extraire des données et des compréhensions. Ça va aller à contester le colonialisme aussi présent en milieu universitaire en faisant appel à des valeurs puis des visions du monde autochtone comme point de départ pour faciliter le développement d'espaces propices à l'autodétermination et à la confrontation des oppressions. Puis finalement, les personnes chercheuses devraient être redevables envers les communautés autochtones des décisions qui sont prises, puis les communautés devraient être les personnes qui jugent à savoir si le projet de recherche, si l'analyse est valide, efficace, etc. Quand on mène un projet de recherche en contexte autochtone au Canada, on a aussi des principes éthiques à mettre de l'avant, à respecter. C'est les principes du PCAP qui vont aller jusqu'à dire que la donnée devrait être gérée et devrait être la possession des communautés. Donc, il faut prendre en considération tous ces aspects-là. Donc, je vais vous illustrer un projet qu'on a fait.
Annie, petite pause. Je crois que c'est Rita. Est-ce que tu m'entends? Parce que la traduction ne marche pas.
Oh non.
Là, c'est Rita? C'est bon? OK. Parce qu'Annie est en train de parler en français. On aurait besoin de la traduction en anglais.
So maybe just while we get sorted out, I'll just say what I said in French in a few words. I was just introducing indigenous methodologies. I was talking about the importance of being, reflecting on positionalities, whether you're indigenous person or not, when you engage in that, and how that is going to affect also the type of methodology you are going to use. And I was saying that indigenous methodologies are, questioning Occidental way of thinking about research, should be respectful of indigenous communities, trying to bring resilience and empowerment, confront oppression, and also confront the way of thinking about research in a colonial institution like universities. So, je vais tourner maintenant un projet que j'ai mené avec des personnes bispirituelles au Québec l'an dernier, je crois. C'est un projet qui visait à comprendre le vécu spécifique des jeunes qui sont trans et autochtones. Donc, quand on parle, en fait, au Canada, on peut parler des personnes bispirituelles, qui est un terme pour parler de la diversité de genre et sexuelle, mais c'est un terme qui est très, très complexe et qui peut englober plusieurs réalités. Donc, on a des personnes bispirituelles, par exemple, qui peuvent s'identifier comme des personnes trans, mais on a des personnes bispirituelles qui pourraient être sur la diversité sexuelle et ne pas s'identifier comme trans. Donc, on voulait comprendre vraiment qu'est-ce qui se passait avec les personnes autochtones et trans. Donc, il y en a qui vont s'identifier comme bispirituels. Juste pour situer un peu, et on voulait notamment comprendre les défis auxquels ces personnes-là, ces jeunes-là sont confrontés. Parce que les personnes trans vont vivre des enjeux qui sont un peu différents. Par exemple, des personnes gays, lesbiennes, bisexuelles. Donc, ce n'est pas toujours les mêmes enjeux. Donc, on voulait vraiment essayer d'aller capturer et on voulait aussi comprendre les facteurs qui contribuent à leur résilience, à leur capacité de s'épanouir, puis aux mécanismes sociaux de résistance et qui contribuent à leur bien-être. Donc, comment on a fait pour engager dans ce projet-là? On a utilisé des méthodologies qui visaient l'empowerment des jeunes parce qu'on ne voulait pas travailler juste en extraction de la recherche puis comprendre leurs défis. On voulait aussi faciliter un processus d'empowerment. Et donc, on a combiné deux méthodologies, les méthodologies autochtones avec une recherche action sociale. Les méthodologies autochtones, il y a une citation en anglais ici qui dit « To create space for self-determination and empowerment of indigenous people and to collectively challenge the oppressive status quo ». Puis, quand on utilise des recherches en action sociale, qui sont des méthodologies plus coloniales, si vous voulez, bien, c'est aussi des méthodologies qui vont favoriser l'autonomisation, l'autodétermination des personnes, mais qui va nous donner vraiment une structure très, très systématique pour justement aller vers un processus d'empowerment. Donc, combiner ces deux méthodologies-là sont intéressantes parce que ça nous permet d'intégrer les visions du monde autochtone et ça nous permet aussi d'avoir une méthodologie systématique pour faciliter la reprise du pouvoir des jeunes. Donc, je ne vais pas rentrer dans tous les détails parce que j'ai seulement 8 minutes au total, mais ce qu'on a fait, c'est qu'au lieu d'aller avec des entrevues, par exemple, on aurait pu faire des entretiens individuels avec ces jeunes-là, on a utilisé un cercle de parole. Donc, où est-ce que les jeunes bispirituels étaient invités à venir partager un après l'autre, avec un bâton de parole, leur expérience, leurs défis. C'est un groupe qui était co-animé par 2 jeunes personnes qui partageaient ces positionnalités-là, donc 2 jeunes personnes bispirituelles, mais aussi l'inclusion d'une personne aînée dans le groupe. Et donc, on a vraiment travaillé sur une période de temps. On rencontrait les jeunes aux 2 semaines pour justement évaluer, comprendre avec eux, co-construire la compréhension des défis puis des forces de ces jeunes-là. Maintenant, il faut comprendre qu'essayer de faire de la recherche comme ça, dans un cadre colonial, universitaire, ça demande plusieurs adaptations. Donc, je vais vous nommer quelques adaptations, puis je vais terminer la présentation en parlant, en peut-être présentant des réflexions basées sur des défis, en fait, qui peuvent se poser en essayant d'intégrer des recherches autochtones. Mais donc, par exemple, il a fallu adapter la collecte de données au cercle de parole, puis aussi respecter les traditions. Si on prenait un focus group qui pourrait ressembler à un cercle de parole, ben on voudrait peut-être enregistrer le focus group. on ferait encore une fois, on poserait des questions puis on extrairait la donnée. Ce qu'il a fallu faire, ben il a fallu penser à comment on peut en fait rendre le processus culturellement sécuritaire pour les jeunes qui participaient. Donc, ce qu'on a décidé de faire, c'est utiliser des papiers, des crayons pendant que quelqu'un anime. Ça, c'était ce qu'on avait prévu. Mais en commençant, par exemple, le projet, ben, la personne aînée nous a dit que, finalement, quand on commence un cercle de parole, ben, on n'en sort pas et puis on ne prend pas de notes dans un cercle de parole. Donc, vous voyez, utiliser une méthodologie autochtone puis vraiment aller jusqu'au bout, ben, ça peut en fait emmener des barrières à ce qu'on verrait comme un processus de recherche plus traditionnel où est-ce qu'on va aller noter toutes les informations qui vont sortir d'un groupe. Donc, tout ça, ça nous a emmené à avoir à, par exemple, modifier les rôles. La prise de notes, ben, les jeunes qui devaient faire la prise de notes et animer, une fois dans le cercle de parole, ne pouvaient plus en sortir. Donc, c'est moi qui s'est rendue à chaque semaine pour aller prendre des notes à l'extérieur du cercle, bien visible des personnes. Les participants, les animateurs, quand on fait un cercle de parole, ben, on passe un bâton de la parole. Donc, les animateurs vont aussi avoir le bâton de la parole pour parler de leur expérience. Donc, ça veut dire que les animateurs se transforment en participants. Et donc, ça veut dire que ça amène des rôles différents et ça nous amène à réfléchir à l'éthique. Ces animateurs-là n'étaient pas supposés d'être des participants. Donc, est-ce qu'on signe des nouveaux formulaires de consentement? L'aîné prend aussi part aux paroles, au partage. C'est pas une jeune personne. Alors, il faut repenser à nos critères d'inclusion, d'exclusion, ou du moins de la manière dont on le présente. On sait que chez les communautés autochtones, la vision des personnes aînées est très, très importante. Donc, ça s'intègre bien en termes de méthodologie autochtone, mais quand on essaye de parler de ça en termes de méthodologie occidentale, c'est plus difficile de dire qu'on fait une recherche sur les jeunes personnes et qu'on a une personne aînée qui participe aux discussions. Donc, ça va demander une réflexion approfondie sur les positionnalités puis sur les critères. Et ça va aussi mener à toutes sortes de problèmes parce que quand on travaille avec des petites communautés puis qu'on essaie vraiment d'aller au-delà d'une recherche participative, bien, ça fait en sorte qu'on va avoir des gens qu'on va connaître qui vont peut-être partager des choses parce que c'est des tout petites communautés. Peut-être, je sais que j'ai pas beaucoup de temps, je termine là-dessus. D'autres enjeux qui pourraient se présenter lorsqu'on fait de la recherche en contexte autochtone, mais aussi avec des approches décoloniales, bien, il faut penser que les personnes participantes avec qui on travaille ont peut-être des expériences traumatiques qui sont liées au processus de décolonisation. Alors, comment on peut s'assurer d'avoir une sécurisation culturelle? Dans notre cas, je pense que l'utilisation du cercle de parole a été quand même vraiment bien parce que les jeunes se sont sentis en sécurité. Mais il faut vraiment avoir une réflexion là-dessus. Il faut aussi penser aux relations de pouvoir. Quand on s'engage dans un processus de décolonisation, on devrait s'attarder aux relations de pouvoir. Quand on est chercheur et qu'on travaille avec des personnes d'un autre groupe avec lesquels on ne partage pas une positionnalité, même juste d'un point de vue de la recherche, on est dans une relation de pouvoir. Donc, comment on fait pour renverser ces relations de pouvoir-là? C'est des questions qu'il faut se poser. Il y a la question de la réciprocité des bénéfices pour la recherche. Là, je regarde là, il faut vraiment que j'arrête. À qui appartiennent les données? La gestion des fonds. Bref, on pourra en parler durant la discussion. Malheureusement, c'est pas assez long. J'arrête de partager mon écran. Voilà.
Merci, Annie. Thank you so much, Annie. Thank you so much for everybody for participating in the panelists, the speakers. I know it's so difficult because you don't want to interrupt people, but this is so rich. I'm going to launch one question and going back to Emma's question, which was, the idea of spaces. How, because all of you've been talking about knowledge. Who is a knower? How can we legitimate those type of knowledge, and how can we break down the barriers that seems to be existing around different people in terms of people seeing as legitimate and other not, or different type of knowledge? But the question I was wondering, because all of you've come up with some principles and ideas and question you're asking yourself, and I'm just wondering, are there some generic principles that we can come up with when we look at EDI and decolonization in research? or to what extent we have to be contextual, and it has to be very much dependent on the places that we are. And that's the question I'm launching to all of you, the panelists, and Donna and Diara. And I'm going to hand over to Isabel, because unfortunately I have to go, which is really bad for an organizer, but I'm sorry, it's for medical reason. So thank you all so much for this, and I hope the conversation and discussion is very fruitful. Thank you.
Donc, est-ce qu'il y a quelqu'un qui voudrait répondre à la question qui a été posée par Caroline? Is there someone who wants to provide a first answer to the question that was asked by Caroline? Annie?
Ouais, maybe I'll answer in English. Do you want I answer in English? Maybe? Yeah. It's complicated, isn't it, the bilingual event? I think that this common principle in terms of indigenous research and EDI research, that of probably challenging oppression, because when we working with those groups, it's all group that may experience different form of oppression. I think when we go in terms of indigenous research, perhaps one thing is distinguishing itself is that you should also pay attention to transforming the structure, because these structures are colonial. So if we talk about decolonization of research, you shouldn't be just trying to, empower, people that you work with, but also in the process, try to transform those structures so that they have those indigenous ways of knowing that kind of integrate themselves. But yeah, that would be my first quick response.
So Paul, do you want to add something to this?
Yeah, thank you, Isabel. What struck me was something that that Donna said, which I wanted to kind of relate to this and maybe push it back to Donna as well, if possible, and Diara. So it struck me, Donna, that there was a materiality to what you were saying was a colonizing mindset, and that raises, in the sense of exploitation and extraction as being purposes, endpoints. And if I might say, it's also about control of nature, say, for a consumption sort of purpose. And that, to me, relates quite strongly to then what kinds of ideas and what kinds of knowledge are legitimate. Because if the knowledge is about harnessing, controlling, expropriating, taking from nature and from people, then there are only certain sorts of knowledge that are geared to that. Whereas, and I think that is also why other types of knowledge are minimized, because the purpose. So I think the purpose of what the knowledge is for is very important in what becomes legitimate or illegitimate. I wondered if maybe any other speakers had thoughts on that.
I mean, yeah, if I can just come back, I think you're absolutely right. I think you're spot on, and I think it's all of a piece, isn't it? It's, your ontological perspective, your epistemological perspective, what counts, what we value, then how the questions we ask, then they all come out of the same, they're all connected. And so I think it is, one of the things that has come out throughout has been issues of positionality and really being clear about what that position, for us as researchers, as, what is our position and what is our reason for doing what we're doing, and how does it fit in with the dominant hegemonic power structures. One of the things, and I see Diara has her hand up, and one of the things we had wanted to talk about, which we didn't have time to talk about, was to talk about, the very legitimation ways in which knowledge is legitimized within the academy, which may stop us or inhibit us from doing certain kinds of research because they won't get published, for instance, because that kind of knowledge is not, published. So Diara, I don't know if I see your hand, so I pass it to you.
Je vais y aller en français pour équilibrer un tout petit peu la langue dans l'activité, parce que je sais qu'il y a la traduction qui est disponible en ce moment. En fait, il y a la vision la question qui a été posée, c'est est-ce qu'on adapte la recherche au milieu auquel sur lesquels on veut travailler. Et moi, je dirais que oui, dans le sens où déjà, pour les personnes qui travaillent, par exemple, sur l'identité, je vais donner un exemple. Quand on travaille sur les identités africaines ou certaines identités autochtones, on va se rendre compte qu'il n'y a pas la perception de la personne comme individu. Et puis, je partageais cela avec Karine Fofou, justement, il y a quelques semaines, dans un échange informel. Mais la notion de l'individu n'existe pas dans plusieurs cultures non occidentales. L'individu n'existe qu'en relation et qu'en rapport à la communauté. Il est une pièce du puzzle de la communauté. Donc, déjà, à la base, dans un contexte d'enquête, de recherche auprès de communautés qui ont cette perception de l'individu, il est complètement impensable d'envisager une analyse, par exemple, de ce qui est dit en termes de récit par l'individu ou des actes de l'individu en isolement, en abstraction de la place de l'individu dans le clan, dans la communauté, dans le groupe ethnique, dans la famille élargie plus largement. Donc, je pense que là-dessus, ça vient complètement chavirer le regard de qui est le sujet. Le sujet n'est pas individuel, mais dans plein d'endroits, le sujet est communautaire. Le sujet est clanique. Voilà. Donc, c'était juste un exemple que je voulais partager en lien avec la question posée. Merci.
Merci beaucoup. Est-ce que Karine ou Nive, vous voulez ajouter quelque chose à ça? Karine, je vois que tu as ouvert ton micro. À toi la parole.
Merci de me donner la parole. Oui, tout ce qui a été dit est très intéressant. Je m'exprime également en français parce que ce sera plus facile pour moi d'exprimer mes idées de manière plus approfondie. Je vais rebondir sur les interventions de Diarra Traoré et Donna. Donc, Donna a parlé notamment du système hégémonique dans lequel nous sommes. Et Diarra a très bien évoqué, je t'en remercie, l'échange que nous avons eu justement sur ces questions. Moi, j'aimerais en fait qu'on tourne tous nos regards sur le fait que nous sommes nous-mêmes en tant que chercheurs pris dans un système hégémonique. Et on ne devrait pas seulement s'interroger sur la démarche méthodologique empirique, mais sur les fondements même de la recherche. Comment expliquer que la recherche soit menée par les membres du groupe majoritaire, par les oppresseurs? Enfin, c'est vraiment symbolique ce que je dis, c'est-à-dire que c'est vraiment l'Occident, les chercheurs occidentaux qui vont faire de la recherche sur les peuples dominés, voilà, pour faire ça. Et il faut se questionner là-dessus, en lien justement avec les analyses qui ont été faites depuis des décennies par des sociologues, par des anthropologues comme Frantz Fanon, comme Édouard Saïd, sur le processus colonial. La recherche, historiquement, s'inscrit dans le cadre du processus colonial. Et parfois, des démarches consistant à aller étudier les peuples dominés, à aller leur apporter de l'aide, ce sont des démarches coloniales. Et je pense qu'en tant que chercheurs, nous devons faire très attention à ne pas se faire manipuler dans le cadre de ce vaste système colonial. Et c'est pour cette raison qu'avoir une approche intersectionnelle en termes de paradigme est primordial. Parce que dans le processus colonial, un élément fondamental, c'est la justification par l'oppresseur du fait qu'il met tout en œuvre pour changer les choses. Mais concrètement, cette justification est aussi un moyen de gagner la confiance, premièrement, de son propre peuple et de gagner la confiance du peuple dominé. Et je pense qu'on doit vraiment faire attention à cette dimension lorsqu'on fait de la recherche.
Merci, Karine. I just asked you, Niamh, do you want to say something? And I see that Annie raised her hand as well. But Niamh, do you want to say something regarding the question that we're discussing now? I don't know if she hears, maybe she doesn't hear me. So Annie, do you want to add something? Oh,
sorry, I cut a bit. Can you repeat it, please?
I was wondering if you want to add something to the discussion.
So in overall, I fully agree with everything we said, and I think there is only one way of progressing, and that's being empathetic and understanding, and I call it epistemological pluralism. So my, for instance, personal approach is to understand that every epistemological or methodological perspective has their own strengths and limitations. It's just to understand them and to know and to respect others' views, and that's only how we can make progresses. And every diverse view will have and contribute a different perspective. So that's my personal view on how to deal with hegemonies and oppression of some, especially some of the epistemological perspectives.
Thank you very much. Donc, Annie, est-ce que tu veux dire un petit mot? Parce que là il est 11 heures, donc on va devoir vraiment conclure. Je vais te laisser dire un petit mot.
Ben, peut-être juste une dernière réflexion sur l'importance de, oui, penser aux positionnalités, mais aussi penser à l'intersectionnalité de ces positionnalités-là, parce que parfois, on peut partager une positionnalité avec un groupe qu'on recherche, mais il y a d'autres dimensions sociales qui font en sorte que ça nous éloigne, que ça ne nous met pas du tout dans la même posture, dans la même façon de comprendre les choses. Et puis, je pense que parfois, on peut dire, ah, ben, c'est correct, je partage la positionnalité, donc il n'y a pas de relation de pouvoir, quand en fait, il y en a d'énormes, et ça peut nuire encore plus au processus, je pense, de décolonisation, de ne pas être conscient de ces multiples positionnalités. Parce qu'en fait, pour moi, il n'y a pas oppresseur et opprimé. Tout le monde a la possibilité d'être oppresseur et opprimant, oppressé dans un projet de recherche. Donc, je pense qu'il faut juste comme aller plus loin en termes de positionnalité. Voilà.
Merci beaucoup. Donc, je vais vous remercier, puis je vais ensuite laisser le dernier mot à Holly qui va pouvoir peut-être te dire une dernière petite chose au nom du Work Inclusivity Research Centre. Donc, au nom du CRI-JaDE, je remercie tout le monde d'avoir participé. On aurait eu probablement... En fait, c'était ambitieux de demander aux panélistes de parler en 8 minutes. Je pense qu'on aurait dû réfléchir au fait que ça nécessite plus de temps pour approfondir ces questions. Donc, mais merci quand même beaucoup à tous les panélistes, à nos deux conférencières Diarra Donat, donc à Paul, à Karine, à Annie et à Niamh pour avoir participé à l'exercice. Et donc, au nom du CRI-JaDE, merci beaucoup et j'espère que nous aurons l'occasion de se revoir dans un autre contexte parce que je pense que la conversation n'est pas terminée, elle ne fait que commencer. Donc, Holly, if you want to say a word, I give you the last word.
I would just like to say as well from the Work Inclusivity Research Centre, I echo those sentiments. I think this is the start of a lot of really interesting discussions between the two groups, and I'd really like to make sure that we continue this. And anyone who wants to be put in touch with people or had ideas about how we might work together on some of these issues in the future, please come and speak to us. And a big thank you to Isabel, Annie, Caroline, and all the wonderful speakers today, and the wonderful translators as well.
Parfait. Donc, merci beaucoup. Thanks, everyone, and we'll probably see you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Goodbye.